There is something greater than Jonah here. Sometimes people pass us things and we treat them lightly, but they can be the Lord passing. I fear the Lord passing, said St. Augustine, timeo dominum transiuntem, meaning by that grace can pass by and not be clasped and grasped and lost forevermore. This was handed to me the other day, and I'm quite puzzled by its content. You can just about see from where you are what's going on here, but at a distance you can't see the detail. Essentially, it's the sacred host, but there are the beginnings of a miracle in the midst. It's only recent, just a few days ago. It's been downloaded off the internet directly, and so I read what it says. Several faithful thronged St. Francis's High School chapel in Secunderabad on Sunday after reports of a Eucharistic miracle at the school's chapel. The sacramental bread bled after it was put up in the monstrance and kept on the altar. The oozing of blood was noticed in the afternoon by a group of 6 persons, including 2 nuns who were praying in the chapel. October the 2nd, being the National Intercession Day, the sisters from St. Francis's Convent had organised a Eucharistic adoration in the chapel from 3 p.m. The newspaper further quotes a witness named Sister Carmel as saying that after about 10 minutes she suddenly saw a red stain. It seemed to be like a small scar. A couple of moments later, a drop of blood gushed out and spread all over the host. Faithful thronged to the school on Sunday, said the report. And on it goes. Now, that's just a few days ago, 2nd of October, and therefore it's full on. The commentary goes on to indicate the possible reasons why this is happening. That the Lord is wounded in the host. He is wounded by lack of respect, by the henceforth generality of mortal sin in the ambit even of that moment which should be one of great intimacy. For if the soul is inviting the Lord into a dark heart, it is very disconsoling for the Saviour, who is purity itself, and the angels also are in reparatory mode, we can be sure. They see what we cannot see. So this is what we need to bear in mind, as in a group like this, which is very much orientated towards prayer for priests, we come to the altar with not just ourselves, but the whole world. The word sacrilege means stealing of the sacred, and the notion of appropriating, of snatching what we have no right to, is profound. What's happening is this, that by a massive ploy from satanic forces, there has been a generality of miseducation around, giving to understand that everyone has a right, and that therefore, if they're in church, they have rights equal to anyone on earth. They are all invited. Well, Pope Benedict actually had fairly strong words about that in his teaching about the Blessed Sacrament. Sacramentum Caritatis has a very clear indication that the priest has to protect the Blessed Sacrament, and specifically these questions of massive invasion of the altar in celebrations where people habitually would not be in a state of grace because they're not praying or going to church normally, is something that has to be looked at. It's happening because no one is saying anything. Well, it's all basically sacrilege head on. You've got a situation where the Lord is massively appropriated, snatching the sacred, that's the meaning. And so what's going on is that essentially it's not having its effect, it's having a negative effect on the soul. Moreover, it's actually leading to a loss of faith for all the others. When one sees that henceforth it's just banal, then what of those 2 millennia of preparation that used to be there? Until fairly recently, people were actually aware of the sacrality. Now, with regard to the consequences of that, it's not just for this life. We know from people who have been in the beyond and back that actually sacrilege is one of the big ones that gets people onto the wrong side in the beyond. So Satan knows it full well, and he's particularly keen on multiplying this sin around the Catholic world. But there is also, closer to us, another element of appropriation. It's when people presume over rights that they haven't, without necessarily being in sin, I mean in grave sin. They can be party to practices which have crept in and which again, from not being corrected or controlled, have become norms against what is actually clear in the indications in the Missal itself, general instruction and so on, where it is clear from all the teachings, even recent, given that every participation in the ministry of the priests has to be in that form of reception and not appropriation. Therefore, this is clearly indicated in the Missal itself, in all the instructions there, in the general instruction and in the rubrics. But if anyone is at any time called upon to help in the distribution of Holy Communion, it has to be physically seen as always coming from the altar, and therefore from the consecrating hands. That is to say, there's a continuity between the consecration and the feeding, and the people receive always all that is coming from heaven. That means, therefore, that the question of directly appropriating, bypassing the priest, going to the tabernacle and so on, is a grave abuse which corresponds to another form of this Latin root of snatching the sacred. I remember celebrating in place of Father Cathal Price one day in Dublin, in the church that he was at the time, and I was horrified to see how it was actually a weekday. Somebody who wasn't even commissioned for that celebration came up and went straight to the tabernacle, which was on the side, and without any reference to the celebrant at all, proceeded to distribute from that side of the church. And I understand that kind of thing is fairly frequent. In other words, it's a liturgical nonsense, because it's a misconception as regards what is going on. The bread of angels is received from the King of Angels, and he is giving himself through the one person consecrated to do that, who has also the ministry of feeding and nourishing both in word and sacrament. And therefore all who receive, even if it's to receive and then also to hand on, must receive from the priest. It's physical with a spiritual meaning. So let's just get this straight. These are things which have crept up and become norms against the will of the church and against, therefore, the will of the one that we're worshipping. Not that long ago, a young lady actually, was very upset and had mentioned this to me in correspondence, that this question of seeing these practices around her in her local church was causing confusion, and also her own children who were small, who had been taught that they were to receive a blessing, but only from the one who would give the blessing, the priest, when they were being intercepted on the way to the priest by lay people who were presuming to bless them in some shape or form, they were very confused and upset. So I just said in my letter of reply to this lady, well, just put your doubts to the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. And she did, just a young mother of a young family. And as the Vatican does, it took very seriously and wrote back a rescript with a number of protocol quite clearly indicating the will of the Church. And that with regard to the tabernacle, they did say quite clearly that it was only deacon upwards who had the right to go into the tabernacle. With regard to the blessing without being a priest, it also indicated the nature of the priestly blessing, which was quite different from anything else. So, all this, just to bear in mind, that if the Lord is, in these last few days, now that's the 2nd of October, we're now only the 10th of October, has given to the world, because these things go around fairly quickly on internet, this sign of bleeding and therefore being wounded in the host, we need to ask why. Is it just to remind us that he's there, or to say I'm there and I'm being badly treated here? Because if that's the case, we must be careful that we're not part of that bad treatment. But also on a daily basis. People who come to the celebration that we have there in Johnstown, just outside Navan, on a Sunday, when they come for the first time, they are pacified by the fact that at least no one talks before, during or after. And before, during and after is a long time, because there are confessions before and confessions for a long time afterwards. And the only sound that you will hear are babies, of which there are not a few, which is a lovely sign. But what is interesting is that they're not people who are particularly into the Latin quite often, but people who are into prayer, and therefore need peace and quiet, and time to absorb the grace at Holy Communion. It's actually quite moving, that moment at Holy Communion, where about 3 times one goes from one end to the other, giving Holy Communion on these lovely people kneeling. One goes up and down, according to the children, because the children have to be blessed. But there's not a sound, and it's very still. And that stillness is extremely encouraging to the soul when it wants intimacy, because the fact of having to get into a queue is actually quite distracting, whereas just kneeling for the Lord to come is a different mode. So there's a stillness in the body, which gives also stillness to the soul. Add to that then the fact that there's been a lot of silence in the celebration, because the canon is all in silence, and also afterwards, there's a long time, about an hour, for confessions, again in silence, and people staying on in church. There's a lot of grace in the air, and also a lot of correspondence with grace. That's the problem. The grace is always the same, but the fruit is by no means the same, because there's a lot of difference between spending a long time after receiving the sacred host in mode of union with the sacred host, and then immediately being obliged to talk about whatever it might be to the person next to you, who as soon as the priest has said, go in peace, is in an explosion of chit-chat. It's grace evaporating straight away into the atmosphere without its fruit. And again, the Lord is inside us, perhaps weeping, bleeding. As he said in the Gospel at one point, me you have not always with you. We can talk about football at another stage. But then this other one, precisely the question of what happens when we're in church afterwards or at any point. This lack of awareness of the presence is very hurtful. When I was just in school and frequenting there the Benedictine church in Cardiff, and in fact any church in Cardiff, I knew that straight away, going past the front doors of the church, there would be no talking. It was just the pattern, and it rubbed off on one. And also the fact that many people would be praying in church. That was something which attracted greatly to the Catholic setup. One went into church precisely to encounter the invisible, and the atmosphere favoured it. It was a great attraction. And so, this which Ellen got to be produced, I quote again, because it's something that we slip into out of courtesy quite often, but we don't have to go that far. We can reply briefly and in a whisper without getting involved in a long conversation. It's little Jacinta of Fatima. She is still, I believe, the youngest beata in the church, who was not a martyr. Noticing that many visitors chatted and laughed in the chapel, in the orphanage in Lisbon. Remember, she was exiled by that time. She died alone, far away from her family. Where she spent her dying days, little Blessed Jacinta, the seer of Fatima, asked Mother Godino to warn them of the lack of respect for the real presence this represented. When this did not bring about a satisfactory result, she asked that the cardinal be advised. That, now this is put in red and in inverted commas, therefore it's from Jacinta, but ultimately from Our Lady, that Our Lady does not want people to talk in church. Now, think about those words next time you engage your voice box. We had in the monastery the fairly simple rule that one did not engage the voice box in regular places. Regular places would be dormitory area, the refectory, the church, and the scriptorium, and also all the corridors. But the church was one of the regular places, and if one did, one had to accuse oneself thereof the following day at the chapter of faults and receive a penance. It maintained the discipline. Therefore, communication would happen at most with a whisper. And not only that, but the prior would not allow us to do anything, not even take the chalice from the altar, for at least 10 minutes after Mass. We had to be back straight away from the sacristy into choir and hoods up or whatever in prayer mode for the duration of the time that we were tabernacles. The teaching was very strong. And also the formation before was a great help, because all that preceded the High Mass was prayer, including Lectio Divina. Therefore the mode was always dovetailing from one to the other. So take away those props and we're at risk. We can get out of breath, arriving just in time to be late for church. Not the best way to settle down. This frenetic mode in which we live contaminates also our prayer. The Lord does not like hustle and bustle. He's a quiet God, a gentle God, and the still small voice needs space if it is to be perceived. Hell is full of noise, and the more noisy we are, the more at home we are with those who inhabit it. So we have this little picture of the child Jesus poking his little nose out of the tabernacle and asking for silence. Shh! If you are going to talk in my house, please talk to me. I am in the tabernacle. I am the Blessed Sacrament. Tell me all your problems, and between us we can solve them all. Please don't distract anyone else from talking to me in my house. St. Benedict, actually in his rule, has this strong one-liner: Sit oratorium quod dicitur. Let the oratory be what it is called. Time comes only once. The time that we have when we're actually tabernacles of Jesus are maximal moments, when the Lord has a lot to say to us if we'll calm down, and a lot to make us feel if we want his gentle touches. Those tocadas of which John of the Cross speaks, those touches cannot be perceived by a barrage of output. Input mode is what we need to feel. As with a person, if one is still shy and nervous, one can't bear silence. When they know each other well, they are happier to be quiet together. They feel each other more by soul. Now, with regard to sacrilege, I want to finish with this. The demon is trying his best to dumb down the doctrines of the Catholic Church with regard to the need for a state of grace to be seen fruitful in the Blessed Sacrament. He's also encouraging that souls get callous and spend years and years without going to confession. In fact, a priest will tell you, often those who come very rarely to confession are those who have least to confess. In other words, they're covered in so much mud that a bit more mud can't be felt. So, that's going to come back somewhere. When it comes to death, they get very good clinical care. Where is the soul? And so it's going to come back. Sacrilege is serious. This came back from the beyond. It's reported by a certain Father Nuremberg. A certain servant of God, finding himself in a secluded place into which no other man had ventured, heard mournful wails which could proceed only from a supernatural cause. He demanded then who were the authors of these piteous cries and what they meant. Then a sad voice replied to him, "We are the damned. Let it be known that we are deploring in hell the time lost, the precious time which we wasted on earth in vanities and crimes." Ah, 1 hour would have given us what an eternity could restore to us no more.